All right, so how do we actually use ethics in research? All right. So out of the list of 10, we're at number 6, so getting ethics if required. Not all research needs ethics. Okay, so I'm sitting in my little study and I'm reading Hansard. That doesn't need ethics. It's a publicly available document. I don't need to go to an ethics committee to do that research. It doesn't involve anybody. Okay, if I was using private diaries, depending on how I was going about getting them, I may need ethics clearance. So discourse analysis is quite good from that regard, because if you're using texts that are in the public domain, ethics is not needed. You just don't need it. But obviously interviewing, ethnography, focus groups, surveys, all of these things where we're actually going to go out and engage a human being requires an ethics clearance. All right, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. What I want to talk about now is the elements of it. Okay, these are basically straight from the textbook. One of the things that's really interesting about public versus private, and again, Michael Walsh does some research in this, is about how the social media and things like that are making the private public. So if you were going to go in and go onto Facebook and grab people's Facebook pages and then actually do research on all their profiles and things that they do, or particular images that they post and things like that, that's technically the public domain, but people perceive it as a private thing. So if they were doing research later on and they found your journal article and it had images from their website, their Facebook page, how do you think they might feel about that? Okay, so it's about, are we really putting things into a public space expecting it to be private versus it actually being public? And people are doing a lot of research in this space now. I can't remember whether it was, I think it was Harvard, where they actually did release some student data and things like that. It was totally stripped, but the students didn't know that their data was being used in that way. So the question is then, who owns your data? And in a world where more and more data is becoming in the public domain, who actually owns it? Do you have rights to your data? The demographic stuff that I get from you guys, like I get a whole set of demographic data on you guys. Why do I get that? Well, I get it to enable me to make some judgment calls, but is that still your private information? So there's this kind of respect element when you're looking at ethics. Then the other thing is that, and the textbook talks about benefits, and it talks about benefit, I can never pronounce benefit, anyway, benefit. I always think of it as benefit. And it talks about it as being do no harm. Well, technically it's do good. So when you're interviewing somebody or you're doing your own research, you have to do some sort of good. There has to be a good element to it. All right, the reading this week is Goffman and the Tea Room Trade. And, did he do good? Interesting question. We'll talk about it next week in tutorials. So the Maleficent, the mal one, which is mal is bad in Italian from memory, is to do bad, is you do harm. Now, what's really interesting about the risk management process is you really don't know when you're in the midst of your research whether you're doing good or bad. Okay, I did some interviews with academics. They're academics, they're researchers, they know the game. I was interviewing academics about, of all things, accreditation processes. It's boring as. But they were angry, like seriously angry people. And so, like one person, it ended up as kind of a cathartic hour and a half of my life I was never getting back. Great data, some of it was just crap, but it's that whole thing, is that she was so traumatised by an accreditation process in a university that talking about it actually made her feel really angry and sad and all these things. And so then after the interview, we actually chatted for about another half hour where I just said, hey, how you going? To try and make sure she was okay. Like seriously, you never know what's going to go wrong. You can never tell, particularly with interviews. Surveys, who cares, you don't see them. But interviews are really up close and personal and they go wrong really fast. So you can go in with the best intentions to do no harm and then end up doing all sorts of harm. And then the question is, ethically, where do you stand in that? which is why I've got what do you find acceptable? All right. Merit. You can't just do research for the sake of it, right? You've got to actually, there's got to be some value to it, or otherwise it's unethical. So this is another element of ethics. It's not about doing harm or whatever, right and wrong. It's actually about being worth something. Like, you can't go in there and take people's time and interview them and all that sort of stuff if you're really not going anywhere with it. If you're like, hey, this is kind of interesting. Oh, yeah, that was boring. And walking, like, you really got to have merit. It's got to be going somewhere. And the justice element, I'm just going to go back to my notes. Oh, justice is about ensuring that you're equitable about it all, right? So you can't actually just go out there and say, I'm going to interview people about blue chairs and only interview men, or only interview women, or only interview white people, or only interview black people, or only interview young people or old people, right? Unless that's what your research question is. If your research question is, what do Australians think about blue chairs? All right, so Australians. So does that mean citizens? Does it mean permanent residences? Does it mean people who live in Australia? So you've got to define Australians, because that's your demographic. But then you need to know what the sample group of Australia is. How many of us are old? How many of us are young? And then your sample group should represent that sample, all right? It should have, if we've got, 40% of our population is over a certain age, then you should have 40% of your people over a certain age. If you're doing it that way, all right? So if you're going to make big claims that all Australians think this, then you need to be conscious about making sure that you've been just. Have you given those people an opportunity to participate? Now, it never works out that way. When we sample in all sorts of different ways. And what that does is justify your research approach. And I'll talk about that in tutorials. So it's about understanding, but it's about making sure you've given enough voices to enough groups to be able to justify your research question and where you're going. Or otherwise you're being unethical. So it's another element of ethics. All right, so the whole question is what you find acceptable. All right, so the actual physical process in research. Now, this is assessment D. I've just got a screenshot of assessment D because you guys are going to have to do ethics for assessment D. All right, the form that I'm giving you in assessment D is actually not dissimilar to the form that I use to get ethics clearance myself. Okay? It's the letter that has to go to your participant. I'm not giving you the 50 million. It's actually about 30 pages of paperwork you have to do to get to ethics. So what happens is if you want ethics, you actually have to do your 30 pages of paperwork. You have to explain what your research project is. You have to explain who you're going to be going to. You have to explain their risks. All right? So, for example, if English is their second language, what are you going to do to support the fact that their English is their second language? If they're a vulnerable group, what are you going to do to ensure that they're not exposed? Okay? So there's a whole list of things. The paperwork in the University of Canberra and the University of Adelaide, because they're the two ethics processes I've been involved in, we use the same paperwork in social sciences as they use for the natural sciences. So it's really annoying because there's questions like, how many drugs are you going to give them? Well, we're not giving them drugs. We're going to go and talk to them. So there's these questions that you still have to respond to. No drugs will be given. Like, you really, it's annoying. But this is a thing, right? Because there's this whole concept of social science and natural science. It's all research. Well, yes, but we do slightly different things. So the paperwork itself is quite onerous. And then it goes to a committee of approvers. Now, those people are random people from the community of the university, academics. So, you might get somebody who's in your field, you might not. So if you're doing research in a particular field or a particular discipline, like let's say you're doing politics and the three people are biologists, well, they're going to have a different view on ethics than you do. So it's a bit tricky sometimes trying to get it through. An example that I did for one of my ethics was it got rejected and it was because I didn't do a sum up, I didn't do an introduction question. So when I gave them my list of questions, I led with question 1. And they said, you've done no introductory. Okay, so then I submitted a piece of paper that said, I will say, hello, how are you? I literally had to put that down because the particular people on the ethics committee on that particular day didn't think I'd been friendly enough. And it's like, really? Okay. So, but there's this concept of what ethics means, right? And is it subjective or is it objective? Because you've got people sitting on a committee passing objective judgment on your ethics of application for your research, knowing nothing about your research. You do a blurb describing what the project is, and you do a blurb describing what the benefit is. The limit is like 350 words. Sometimes 350 words is not enough to describe the benefit of your research, the merit of your research. So I think it's kind of an interesting process. But when you do the assessment D1, please take note. That is literally what I gave my candidates. Sorry, I call them candidates. I don't know why. Participants. So it's not, I've just adjusted and tailored it a little bit. So that's the actual process. So in ethics, we have to fill in forms, we send them off to a committee, and they do it. All right, and of course, people like Milgram and Goffman didn't have to do this. This is kind of new.